Good morning.
Good morning.
Today is the 20th of October 2010, and I'm a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in California. Part of our mission is to record and preserve the history of our country's military conflicts, especially World War II. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who performed in these conflicts. Today we have the honor and the privilege of interviewing First Lieutenant Jack O'Neill. Jack was an Army Air Corps pilot in World War II. So we are going to talk to him about his experiences. Nice to have you here, Jack.
I'm glad to be here.
Jack, if you would, spell your full name and tell us where you were born.
I was born in Stamford, Connecticut on September 7th, 1923. Where I was born and then what?
Just where were you born? That's it.
Yeah, okay.
And you were born in
23, September 7th.
September 7th. And can you tell us a little bit about Stamford, Connecticut, what your house was like when you growing up?
I lived in, to the best of my memory, older homes, one of which somebody had put rat poisoning out, and my sister and I ate the rat poisoning, which was in the form of sugar, and we both ended up in the hospital, but nothing serious other than being sick.
And your mother and dad, can you tell us on your dad's side of the family what his heritage was?
My grandfather was a builder, and he built many houses in Stamford, Connecticut. My father was always into radio, and he was in radio his whole life. He worked for ABC for 25 years or 30 years, and ended up, finished his career in California at ABC studios in Hollywood.
Was he an announcer or a broadcaster? Was he a broadcaster, announcer?
No, he was the engineer. He did the mixing, mixed the sound. Broadcast engineer is what he did.
Okay, and what was his heritage? Was he like you, Irish? You know, is it a continuation of your Irish heritage?
Well, my grandfather, father were very strict Catholics, and so he saw that this is the way we were brought up in the world, and it's the one thing that I've hung on to through all these years. I had 3 other siblings besides me, sister and 2 other brothers, and nobody else in the family carried on in the same Catholic upbringing except myself.
And did your family, can you trace back, say, where he came to America and whether his parents were traced back to Europe?
My father was born in the United States. My grandfather came from Southern Ireland, and where the famous stone is that you lean over, and
Blarney Stone.
Blarney Stone, and
Yeah.
then I think I don't remember the name of the town, but that's where it is. Yeah. And my grandmother was Annie Daly, so she was also Irish.
And from Ireland.
Yeah.
She was. So
Yeah.
both your grandparents came from Ireland.
Right.
And did they come right to Connecticut, or did they come?
I don't really know much about their early history, except that my grandfather always talked about the blizzard of 1888, and he had to walk the railroad tracks home from wherever he was to get home, and there was no other way for him to get home.
This is in Ireland.
Yeah. No, in Connecticut.
In Connecticut.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you know what kind of education your grandfather had, whether he was high school or
I don't know.
grandmother?
I presume basic grammar school, and I don't know anything beyond that. My father, high school, and that's it. And he got a commercial license, radio operator, and I remember there was a man who became later an Eastern Airline pilot, and he had to deliver a airplane up to Massachusetts outside of Boston, and my father had to go to Boston to take the commercial radio operator's license, and which in those days was handwritten. And my father passed it with flying colors, and that's how he became a commercial radio operator, which was his intro into radio and television.
And the family house, can you remember with, you said you had 2 brothers and a sister.
Right.
Where did they line up, older, younger?
I was number 2, my sister was the oldest, and she had her own bedroom. The 3 boys, I slept in a double bed with my brother for our whole growing up years, and my brother Billy had the one bed by himself, but 3 boys were in one room.
And can you remember how the house was heated?
We had, in those days, we had steam heat, and what I remember about the winter times is undoing the valve on the side, letting the old cold air out until you heard the hissing of the steam, then you'd screw it back in again, and then you had heat.
And was there a basement in the house then?
Yes, basement. There was a coal bin. First, what I remember is a coal bin, and that was what we used to fire the furnace with. Then we went to coke next, and that's all I remember. We never got out of the coal area.
Can you remember whether you eventually had what they called a stoker, where coal came and it was crunched up and with oil on it,
Yeah.
and it fed, and you had a clinker in the...
Yeah, but so you could get those clunks out of there. But we used to take it and shut it down, take them out, and then restart it. There was no hot water upstairs, so when we wanted to take a bath, once we grew older, we had to heat the water on the stove in the kitchen and then carry it upstairs and dump it into the tub and add the cold water, and that was our bath.
So there was just one bathroom for...
One bathroom for 6 people.
6 people, and it was upstairs.
That's right.
Yeah. And indoor plumbing, I'm assuming then. You
Yes,
didn't have to have it.
yeah, no outside, but I understand that, no, I always had a bathroom.
Uh-huh. And so, sister having her own room, she was kind of like the queen of the house then.
That's right. Yeah, she was the favorite.
And what was the, pretty much the diet that you might have had? Was it kind of an Irish diet?
Kind of an Irish.
You know, where...
Diet.
Irish diet, you know, where the food was...
Oh, my mother was an early forerunner of what nutrition is today. My mother was what I call a food nut in the early days. This is in the 30s, the 1930s. We only had whole wheat bread, no white bread, no white sugar ever in our growing up lives. My friends, when I told them on Thanksgiving we had dressing with whole wheat dressing in the turkey, they wouldn't believe us. And you know, but she was fed us kind of plain food in all our growing up years, and but no, to us to have anything in the way of a dessert or a cake, we never saw much of that. My mother occasionally would make a cake for a birthday, but that was it.
How about canning? Did she can a lot of...
No candy. We never had candy in our growing up lives.
And did she say canned fruit, you know?
Oh, no, she did not.
Vegetables, did she can?
Well, she might have, but I don't, in those days, all I can remember is my mother telling me a whole big box of groceries was $10.
It was a little local market.
Local market, and they delivered it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you have the guy coming around with the wagon and the horses selling fruit and vegetables and things like that?
Not too many of them. There was a small dairy up the street from me, and that's where we went to get our milk. And I think we paid 14 cents for a quart of milk. And I used to love to go to the dairy, and when they were pasteurizing the milk, and as it comes off the cooler, you could stick the bottle into the bottler, and there it was delicious milk like that.
Well, I guess. And you didn't have a milkman then? You just always, where he'd come by and put the milk?
Yeah, we had one milkman for a while, but that was it.
You remember at the winter time when you'd go out to the bottles?
But the cream top, what we call
Would pop up?
would pop up. Here you'd have this thing about that towel that came out of the top of the bottle.
All the cream.
And we had this baker that delivered mostly bread and once in a while some other form, and he would come early in the morning. He came all the way out of the Bronx in New York City delivering bread. Name of the company was called Dugan's, and it was Dugan's Bread for the Home, and that was the name of it.
Oh, darn.
And he was an Irishman also, and he'd come in, how are you? And it was anything that had sugar on it, we used to think, wow, this is great.
Did you have ice cream then? Would your mom let you have ice cream?
No?
No ice cream, huh? And was there a car in the family?
Yep.
Do you remember what it was?
Something called an Oakland is a forerunner of the Pontiac.
So it was a General Motors product?
Huh?
It was a
General Motors
Oh.
car. My father, in about 1933, got a bonus from the U.S. government for all World War I veterans, and it was a bonus. This was to stimulate the economy, and my father got something like $250 from the government for his service. He was a sailor in World War I on the battleship Pennsylvania, and he went to Europe on the battleship Pennsylvania, but he was a radio operator on the battleship Pennsylvania.
oh my darn.
And he said we had a priest on board, and when they got to France in the battleship, and then the priest supposedly could speak French. Well, they sent him ashore to meet the local dignitaries, and he said he couldn't really understand, they couldn't understand him.
They couldn't talk in Latin, huh?
Yeah, whatever. And then that's the other thing, in the religion, it all started out with Latin at the service, and now it's changed more into plain language.
Yeah, it's lots of changes.
Yeah, oh, it has.
Now, your two younger brothers,
Yeah.
how far apart are you in ages?
My sister to me is 2.5 years, 15 months from myself to my next brother, and then Billy, 2 years later. And then the fifth child, a boy, died shortly after birth. Not that there was anything wrong with him. A doctor bought I can't remember the name of the disease, where he had treated somebody, another baby, and hadn't cleaned his hands. So when he came into now my youngest brother, whatever infection it was, he carried over to him, and it killed him.
That's still going on.
But I out of the 5 children, I was the only one born in a hospital. The other 4 were all born at home.
So, with the same family doctor?
Yeah, I don't know who.
It was a doctor, though, that did it, not
Yeah,
a...
and I have no idea who that was.
Well, if you had to go to the doctor, as a kid, there's always... No?
Yeah, well, you never went. Who had money?
Yeah.
And as I grew older and we moved from Stanford into Darien, where I grew from age a little past about 5.5, age 5.5, we moved from Stanford to Darien. And so all my growing up years were in Darien.
How far was that from...
4 miles.
Oh, so...
And so all of our growing up years were in Darien, my sister included. Her children would say to me, "Did my mom get all straight A's?" I said, "Yes, she did."
Now, being in a good Irish Catholic family, Dad kind of ran things, didn't he?
Yeah, well, he was, but my father was a very gentle, easygoing man. My mother was kind of the goer. She was German.
Oh, okay.
Her name was Graf, which is a big name in Germany. And she was a Graf. Her father, at one time, she told me how wealthy they were when she was like a teenager. And her father had 3 meat markets in that area. And he became an alcoholic, and it was kind of the end of him.
So, do you know how your mother and Dad met? An Irishman and a German?
I don't know the history of that, no. My mother was a very outgoing person. In Greenwich, Connecticut, there's an island called, I don't remember what they call it. You took a ferry boat from Greenwich out to the island. Island Beach, they call it. And there's a 40-foot tower there. My mother, when she was younger, would dive off of that 40-foot tower. And we thought, wow. I don't know if you've ever been up 40 feet in a tower and looked down. That's a long way down.
It's about the height of a carrier deck off the water,
Yeah, well, it's something. Or from a 747, it's almost 40 feet to the ground.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, kids, particularly, you went then to a Catholic school, parochial school?
No, there was no, in my town, there was no Catholic school. We went to catechism every Saturday. My mother saw that we all got there. And we did all our first communions and confirmation were all done in the same church.
Even after you moved?
Yeah, this is all our growing up years. We went to a small church called St. John's, which was there in Darien. And there was a lot of wealthy people in one part of Darien, and they kind of funded the church and so that it got what it needed.
Do you ever remember, as the Depression came on, how bad that was for your family?
A lot of people ask me that. I knew there was no money, but we always had food on the table. We always had a home to live in. And to us, I don't think we ever saw a bad side of the Depression, although my sister and I and 2 brothers all grew up in it.
Now, as you got a little older, did you have to get a job, working somewhere?
We always worked, kids, boys. We used to shovel snow in the wintertime. That was one of the things where we could get some income. But I led, my brother and I led polo ponies. And these people who had polo ponies, and they played a polo match called the Oxbridge Hunt Club. And and once a week, and then on the weekends they had a polo match. And what I did, or my brothers and I, and some of our friends, we did the cooling off of the horse after he played a chukker. They'd sponge him down, and our job was to walk him around after they did that. So I did that, and after the game was over, we had a German named Otto, and I don't remember his last name, and we used to go with tampers, these wooden blocks with a handle in it, and tamp down all the turf that was torn up from the horses. And we made 50 cents an hour or some ridiculous somehow.
Did you ever deliver magazines or newspapers?
Yes, I did. I delivered newspapers for a year or two, growing up on a bicycle. And
How about magazines? Did you ever have to?
no magazines. But,
Were your brothers doing similar things, or?
yes, and we always worked. And then we got into golf in my 14 years old. The Weber Country Club, and my brother Pete and I always caddied there. And that's how I learned to play golf and love golf. And about 1938, they had the Women's National Open. It was at Weber Country Club, which was a big thing for us then.
Well, I'll bet.
Yeah.
And your sister, was she pretty much kind of around the house help with your mom, or did she do things?
Well, my sister worked, but I can't remember what she did. She was a Navy spar. In fact, all four of us were in the service at one time.
And as you're, like most kids, you had to be playing games and sports. And
Oh, we always played. We used to play, sandlot baseball, football, that kind of thing. We had some fields around us which were owned by rich people who let us, use it. And we played a lot of touch football, and we played baseball there and those things.
did you have a favorite team growing up, sports teams?
I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan early in my career. I always was faithful till they moved to LA, and then I kind of lost, but Evansville, which is where the Brooklyn Dodgers were, until
Have
I forget
favorite
what
players?
year. Huh?
Did you have some favorite players?
Yeah, Duke Snyder, and a guy who was a real sharp, crisp hitter, and he always line drives. I can't remember his name, but Evansville, and we always sat up, so bleacher-like things, and you look down, and my God, you look like you were going to fall down. Yeah, but I loved that. I saw a no-hitter in Polo Grounds, Giants, and I don't remember who the other one is, and the guy pitched a no-hitter. His name was Ed Head, but I don't, that's
Oh.
all.
To get from your house to Ebbets Field, how'd you get there?
By car, and it would take about an hour.
So your dad was driving you, is that it?
My uncle, my wife's uncle used to take us. By then, I wasn't married then, but that's who I went with, John Chillington.
So, in high school then, did you play high school sports?
I weighed 132 pounds in high school. And, I played on the football team, but I was a, substitute, and I just wasn't big enough. Of the three boys, I was the smallest of the other two were bigger than me.
How long did it take before your younger brothers could beat you up as you grew up?
Took them a while. I didn't tolerate that.
Don't forget the chess club, Daddy.
Was there a chess club?
Yes, I played in a chess club in high school.
How'd that go? Was you a pretty good chess player?
Well, I was number 5 on the team, but I enjoyed it. And chess is a thought game. It teaches you how to think. Really.
Yeah.
So I did that.
Play any musical instruments?
No,
Any
I
of?
would have loved to have done. I always liked the piano, and I would have loved to have done it, but I never.
Any of the other kids, your brothers or sisters?
No,
Any?
nobody ever played.
No
any-
piano in the house, or?
No piano in the house.
No
Later, when Binky grew up, then we had a piano, but no musical instruments in the house. I knew other families, and they would sit down as a group and play some kind of music or some kind of instrument. And harmonica was popular then because it was cheap.
You know, my neighbors every one of my neighbors played or sang or did something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was, but we were a happy family. We always.
Did you go to church, the whole family together?
Yes.
We did. No one went to early mass or late mass. You all went.
No, we were always usually about a 10 o'clock mass is where we were. And
You always sit in the same pew at church.
yes, and my friends used to say, "Here come the gospel O'Neills." Well, my father never got anywheres on time. All of our growing up years, we used to call him Johnny Come Lately. Because my father, as great as he was, and he did wonderful things for us, he taught me how to.
Okay, keep going.
He taught me how to build model airplanes. That's how I learned from him how to build models. And then I went into the smaller ones, and the first they didn't have any radio control things back in those days, and I in turn taught my son Michael how to build models.
Now, in those days, they were a lot of paper and balsa wood and
we had balsa wood and tissue paper type of.
you put
cover.
water on them to put water on the
right,
paper
and
to.
and it made it.
Yeah.
And what we did, we put a timer on the engine, and that's what shut off the engine. And I remember one guy who had just built this beautiful airplane, and he was on his test flight, and we said to him, "Larry, did you set the timer?" It kept going.
You ever find it?
Never found it. If you didn't set the timer, it wasn't going to shut off the engine. So I learned a lot about flying as a kid growing up because I made models.
Things are happening as in Europe with the Germans going into Austria and Hungary. Does your mother keep track of that?
You know, my mother, although she was a German, and her mother and father were German, and she never said much about the war. She worried more about us as individuals, and the Battle of Britain and those things in '39, which we all followed by radio. Radio was the big thing.
And what else was there, besides the radio?
And I can.
Moving pictures.
Yeah, well, I can remember Max Schmeling and floored Joe Louis, and was that? And then he came back a year later and beat him and all that. But that was our entertainment, was the radio.
I remember losing a bet. Guy bet me that Joe would win the fight.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was Jersey Joe Walcott and Joe Louis, so Joe won.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
Now, Irish are known to be hard living, hard drinking, good time type of people.
Yeah,
Was
they
that?
are.
Were your
I think
neighbors?
that's a truism. And and my brother had a home the later years in Ireland, and I used to go over there, and I saw, this would be in the early '60s, and that's the first I went to Ireland was then, and I said, well, what about these people? They're out there digging a ditch in patent leather shoes. Oh, he says, they don't want anybody to know that they dig a ditch for a living, so that when it was time to go to the pub, which was probably 4 or 5 in the afternoon, they always were dressed properly for the pub. And I said, they don't have work clothes. Well, that's the way I watched this. I couldn't believe it. But they love to party. They love to get you drunk. I used to kid them, but I said when I was there in later years, in the upper '60s, and I used to say to them, well, your liquor is only 65% or 60% alcohol, whereas ours is something like 80% proof. And I said, that's why you can drink all that liquor and not good. And but they love that. They love a good time. They love a party, and everybody you meet over there, and they say, "Oh, where are you from?" "Oh, listen, I have a sister in Cleveland, Ohio, or L.A. or whatever." And they, of course, had no idea how long it was to go from Connecticut to L.A. or Cleveland or Chicago or anything like that.
Yeah.
And but they're a fun-loving people.
Well, your neighborhood where you grew up, was it primarily all Irish neighborhood?
No, was not. Mixture.
Mixture.
A lot of wasps in my area. Yeah. And we were Catholic, and I look up and down the street, and maybe 1 or 2 other families. The rest of them were mostly WASP type people.
Uh-huh.
And but my mother saw to it that we went to church every Sunday, and you better be there.
Okay. Well, as you got older, you know, into your junior and senior years in high school, were there some female interest showing up in?
Well, I never had a big interest in girls. In my early years, I was content to make models and fly them, and I remember, like, I was a junior in high school. I never dated a girl, and finally said, well, you know, it's time for you to take a girl to the dance. And I said, why? And that was the other thing my mother made us do. She said, listen, as you grow older, you're going to want to know how to dance. So she saw to it that we went to dance where we learned how to dance. Are we running out?
Oh no, it's going good.
Yeah. So I'm thankful that she taught us, okay, because she says you're going to have to know how to dance. So she saw to it that we learned how to dance.
Your sister too?
Huh?
Your sister
Not
too?
my sister, no, just my brother and I, Pete. And anyway, but we had some great times.
Now,
But that's how I learned how to dance, was my mother made us go learn.
well, your high school had dances, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You had the freshman hop and the sophomore and the other. No, that's what. But well, I didn't have any big interest in girls until maybe junior, senior in high school.
Did you have a favorite dish that your mother made that was kind of your
Yeah.
special?
My mother used to make what they call grape nut pudding. And that we thought, wow, this is a rare thing. It was grape nuts and custard, and it was delicious. But she never made us much in the way of desserts.
Well, did you have some of the other typical Irish dinners, or like
Fish always on Friday.
yeah?
That came in a can.
Okay.
And
How about corned beef? And,
yeah, Well, certain times of year, corned beef and cabbage we'd have. My father had something with his gallbladder or in the early years. My father took me for an airplane ride in what is now LaGuardia Airport. My father used to have to go to New York City, I guess, to get the kind of medical attention he needed, and he had to have acidophilus milk was part of his diary or his diet, and so we had to do with what he did. He'd make a very conservative diet, and therefore we had to kind of go along with it.
Sure.
And but when I was age 4, he took me for an airplane ride in what is called, it was called North Island in those days, and in a 2-seater low-wing airplane. The pilot sat in the back, and my father and I sat in the front cockpit, and we took off for LaGuardia and made one big sweep back on the ground. I was 4 years old.
Wow.
And
What an experience.
That's 1927.
Wow. Now,
my uncle, who was a pilot, used to take me flying when I was like 10, 11 years old.
you remember what kind of airplanes they know?
Yeah, Taylorcraft.
Taylor, okay.
Yeah, mostly were Taylorcrafts. He rented them, and he used to come get me and take me flying with him. And that's where I developed my love for
Sure.
flying.
Now, did you have a special suit you wore at church every Sunday that you could only
I
wear?
don't remember that as being. We had to get dressed for church. That's all I remember. Nothing special though.
Would they make you wear a shirt and tie to
Oh
church?
yeah, you know.
And a coat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In those days, especially the East Coast, everybody wore a shirt and a tie.
And your mother had to wear a veil or a hat?
Hat.
Did they wear the gloves, your mother? Did
Yeah.
she? Yeah.
That's the way they all grew up in those days.
Well, I'm
Father
sorry.
McGuan.
Too bad it's changed.
Yeah, my Father McGuan. That's who I grew up with as far as our learning about the Catholic religion. And we used to go every Saturday. We went there.
So, somewhere around 37, 38, 1937, 38, you should be finishing up high school. Do you
I
remember?
graduated in 41.
41.
Yeah.
And
I went to my 50th high school reunion in 1991.
okay.
And my brother, who lives in Macau now, outside of Hong Kong, and
Is he the same one that has the house in Ireland?
yes, which he sold after a number of years. Should have kept it because at one point in time the prices in Ireland went out of sight as far as, but this was a big 4 or 5 bedroom home with a big wall in front of it and a drive, and it was on 3 or 4 acres of property, and it had rose gardens and everything. It was a very nice home, and
Well, it sounds like he was quite successful.
well, 3 of his children were born on a little corner street in Vietnam. He was a businessman. He went over there to work for the government. This is, in the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, and he used to know whoever the governing head then was in Vietnam. He used to walk right into his office. My brother and sister were both red-headed, freckled people,
They would have
and
been.
my mother was a redhead. So Billy and I, my younger brother, were blonde kids, and my brother Pete and my sister Holly were redheads.
So, you graduated in 41.
Uh,
That would have been prior to World War II starting.
yeah, and that's when I learned if I soloed in October of 41.
Well, let me just ask, can you remember where you were when December
Oh, yes.
7th happened?
December 7th, 1941, there was maybe 6 or 7 of us out playing touch football on the edge of a golf course, and a young lady that we knew, and her father was very tolerant of us, and somebody came out of the house and they said, "Hey, you know what happened? They burned Pearl Harbor," and we all couldn't believe it.
Did you know where Pearl Harbor was?
I knew where Honolulu was, but I don't know if I ever knew where Pearl Harbor was.
Well, so did you quit football and go in and listen on the radio?
Well, we all kind of gathered around, what is it? And then we all went in to listen what was going on.
So you were at a girlfriend's
Yeah,
house,
wow, right.
and so what was the reaction in the group? What came out of that day?
Well, from what I remember about it, I think that our enthusiasm, I don't know, as children growing up, we had a great love for our country, which I don't think we have today as great a love for our country as we had then.
They don't teach it.
Well, whatever it is, there isn't that,
Yeah.
they don't understand that we live in the greatest country in the world, and it's only if you travel outside the United States you realize that you live in a pretty good country, and I don't know why they don't raise that belief that, hey, this is your government, whether they're right or wrong, at least that's who the president is, and then.
Well, when you heard, you were not at your own home then when this happened. So when you got home that day with your own family,
Well,
what was said?
we were all talking about it, my father and my mother didn't come much into the conversation, but we talked about it at length, what was going to happen, and of course, my thought, hey, listen, let's go to war. I want to do something, and most of my friends are of that desire that they wanted to. We wanted to join up and go do our thing.
Now, when you graduated from school, roughly in grades, were you like an A student, a B student?
I graduated 18th in a class of 65.
Okay, top
Yeah.
third.
Yeah, B plus, whatever.
Well, that has a lot to do with, like, I think, what you pick to do in life is, if you're used to being challenged and you're playing sports and you're getting your grades and you have a job and you're a part of life, I think that helps decide where you want to go. I've done these interviews and
Well, I always knew when I was a young man, and I don't remember what age, that I always wanted to be a pilot for American Airlines.
and why American?
I don't know. I mean, all I knew in those days, DC-3 was that's all I knew there was, then. So that's the only airplane, and I had a dream once, and it was American Airlines DC-3.
I can remember saving the paper bags from the grocery store so I'd have something to draw pictures of airplanes on
Yeah,
as a kid, because we didn't have the paper to waste it, but I could use the paper bags
right.
and cut them up, and make them.
Pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so you're 18 at this time, 19?
I was 18 in September of 41, And I went into the service the following August of 42.
So you had made a decision then that you wanted to be in aviation, right up
That was
from the time you were 4 years old. You were
Yeah.
going to be a pilot.
Yeah, I did.
So you have to go join some service somewhere. Where do you go to join the service?
Oh, well, you took some tests, you know, and then see whether you're qualified and all that.
Did you pick the Army, the Army Air Corps, the Navy?
I picked the Navy first, and I went into their program. I took the test prior to it, and in those days, you went down somewheres off of Broadway, was where you went for the interview. They put you in a chair and spun you around. And,
This is in New York?
yeah, New York City.
Okay.
Because it's like 45 minutes in a train to go from Darien, Stanford area to mid-Manhattan. Then you get on the subway and went downtown further. But that's where I went. And I picked the Navy, maybe because my father was in the Navy. And I remember one time when we were kids, the Navy had a big display of ships in the Hudson River there, and where the lower bay was there, and he took us to his battleship, which happened to be the Pennsylvania, was there, and he took us all around and showed it to us.
I bet that was a thrill for him.
Yeah, yeah.
To see his old ship.
Yeah.
Did his ship ever get in combat in World War I? Did other?
Oh, he was, yeah, in World War One. Yeah, they fired those 16-inch guns into France or whatever. Yeah, yes, they were in combat. Or
He didn't get in a surface Navy shootout with German ships. It was
No,
primarily just
nothing like
in
it.
support of the
Yeah.
troops.
And the battleship, you know, how a battleship is tremendous in size. And
Oh yeah.
I don't know how many people is on a battleship, but probably 4,000 or 5,000 people on a battleship.
Now, you pick the Navy, you take their test, and what happens?
Well, I went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, went to pre-flight school.
And you got to Chapel Hill on the train?
Yes.
On the train.
In fact, they, in New York City, we went down to Manhattan to Grand Central, or maybe it was Penn Station, probably Penn Station. And that's where we're all grouped around as a group. And they put us on a train and took us to Chapel Hill. And then they gave us a small pack to take your clothes and send them home. And then they gave us our military, our shirts and pants and that kind of thing.
Did they call you cadets or midship?
Cadets, yeah,
You were naval cadets.
right.
And were any of your buddies with you from home, or did you go in together, or did you separate now? And
No, but there were guys from Connecticut, that I went with. One was from Bridgeport, one New Haven, and one somewhere else. So, and we were like 4 in a room. These are college dorms, I guess, that they turned into World War II as a place where we had teachers who were former professors or whatever.
so you're in ground school right
Yeah.
now. And how long would that have lasted?
What they first did with us was they sent a group of us from my area to Buffalo, New York, to learn how to fly. And we were at the Buffalo airport, and Piper Cubs, and of course I already knew how to fly because I had soloed already, so that was easy. And I forget how much time we got, and I guess it was like a weeding out process. The guys that didn't make it, well, then they weren't gonna go to pre-flight school. And I don't remember how they determined who, you know, whether you could solo, couldn't solo, whatever.
You say you had already soloed. Where did you take your flight instructions?
Danbury, Connecticut.
And were you paying for that yourself?
Yes, I was.
And then was that from your?
It cost $2 an hour for the airplane, and $3 an hour was the flight instructor.
And can you remember what kind of an airplane you were in?
50 horsepower Piper Cub.
Piper Cub. And you did this on your own. I mean, you.
Yeah. Well, after high school, I got a job. I worked, the summer I got out of high school, I worked in the locker room of the country club, shining shoes and cleaning the toilets. That was, and the shower room, that was my job. And then in the fall, I went to work for a company called Macklets.
Go ahead, Keith. Go ahead.
And they made X-ray tubes, and that was in the fall, and then the war came along, and then I worked for Macklin, and then I went to work for a chemical company after I came back from flight training in Buffalo, New York.
Well, you really had a love for flying that is something I haven't run into that much. Where someone started out as early as you did, in a time when airplanes were just becoming popular.
Yeah.
And so, to hear your dad's flying
Yeah.
to New York.
1938, he got his license, pilot's license.
Your dad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And did he ever own an airplane? Or?
Yes, he did. Later, he owned two different airplanes. He owned first one was a Taylorcraft, which he and my mother flew on. When he was working for ABC as a broadcast engineer, and he and my mother, he had a 1 month's vacation every August. So he and my mother got in that Piper Cub, or that Taylorcraft, and they flew from Connecticut to California, where my father's uncle lived in Santa Monica. And it took them a week going and a week coming home. And I think back on it today, what a great thing he did.
Yeah.
You know, that was no VORs in those days.
Just a rotating beacon. That was.
Yeah, and my father knew radio, so he knew, you know, he could. My father, as a ham radio, you know, they did it by code. You know, he could do that, or he could talk, either way. So, yeah, he and my mother went from Connecticut, and that ended up. Maybe every 2.5 hours you had to land for fuel, because that's about all you could fly. And
Yeah.
you flew at 90 miles an hour, and my father kind of went out through the Southwest that way. And anyway, he got into the desert part of eastern California, and I forget the name of the airport. And he said, "This is August, you know how hot it gets out there." So he says, a man in a straw hat came out. "Oh, you damn fools! Come on in here, get out of the heat." So anyway, he left he got to in the Cajon Pass there. I can't remember the name of the airport. There's a airport. So they told him, and my father knew nothing about L.A. proper or how to fly in it, and although in Santa Monica there is an airport. So they advised him, "You leave the airport here, we're going to put you on a bus, and that'll take you to where you want to go." And so he took the bus, went there, spent a week with his uncle, and And then they got back on the bus, came to Bannister, I think is the name of the airport. Got back in the airplane, flew home, and it took them a week.
I wonder, did they have radio range by then?
Yes,
The
yeah.
da-da-da-da-da.
And that's what my mother said. Well, she said, your father would never talk to me. He had that headset on, listening to that A&N all the time.
That's all we had you probably too, when you first started flying,
Yeah.
was
I took my instrument rating doing a radio range, orientation, and let down. And that was the A and the N, and that was it.
Yeah, and they practiced in a link trainer,
Yeah.
the old link.
But
Now, so this has really been interesting. You were okay with your Navy basic flight training,
right.
and so you're into some form of advanced training by now in the Navy?
That was my next step, was to go to advance. I had already been measured for my uniforms in Corpus Christi. I was somewhere in that area, and they came out with this thing. I was struggling a little bit with my navigation off of that Ouija board, I called it, how to do carrier intercepts and go fly your mission and come back, and
like variation and deviation
and the E6B.
Yeah.
You know, the startling thing about that is, to me, the E6B, and this is in the 40s, was the primary computer way to compute how you were going to go, ground speed, wind, and all that. And when I was teaching students, 40, 50 years later, is it out?
No, it's okay. I'm gonna.
Yeah, 40, 50 years later, here's the same E6B doing the same job, which I marveled at, that something we used that many years before was still one of the better ways to learn how to navigate your way around the country. But anyway, to continue with the fact that the E6B was a basic way of navigating then, and here it is all these years later, and they were still using the same thing. Today, with the advent of GPS, nobody knows how to navigate anymore. If you took the GPS away from them, they wouldn't know how to go from A to B. They don't know how to plot a course or anything. They've become so used to the punching in the numbers for a GPS or the letters that's the only way. Go direct, and that does the navigating for them. They don't know that much about navigating.
I was always uncomfortable. I had to keep track on a map and on the VOR, even with the
Absolutely.
GPS. I had to know.
That's the way all of us
Yeah.
who learned on the way up. That's how we learned. Okay, you went from VOR to VOR, but today with GPS, nobody knows how to go.
I had the map, I had the GPS, I had the VOR and the TACAN. I kept all three of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I just had a student did his instrument rating, private instrument, an instrument test. And so part of the test, and the examiner, or designated examiner I had, the guy I've known for 20 years, they gave him a clearance in Kansas City, and there was a VOR on the airport, which there was no airway, so to speak, in the en route low altitude chart. There was no airway number there. We used to just go direct. Then they come out somewhere along a few years ago, 2, 3, whatever, and there is an airway, Victor 528 or something like that. So they give them a clearance to go from what they call in Olathe, Kansas, to Topeka, which is about 45 miles, and to go on the Victor Airway. So he takes off, and that's his clearance. No, he said to the examiner, he says, I don't think I know how to do that.
Well.
This guy was a business guy. You know, he ran at full speed, 40 years old, full speed during the day. He was a business advisor to small businesses. So when he came to me, he had been pumped up all day long. He came to me,
Yeah.
and he'd say, "Okay, let's go." And we never talked much about. He never allowed enough time to talk about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, and then he wouldn't retain part of it. We'd have to go back and return. But he flunked his first ride on an instrument rating because he didn't know how to fly a VOR, basically.
Well, we'll go back. So you said you were having trouble with the E6B and the navigation, and I remember it clearly, you know, and
Yeah.
so I know what you're saying. And so what did that involve then? What happened from that?
Well, so at that time, the U.S. Navy, the agreement when you signed up for enlistment to the Navy, there was which I never knew anything about, there was an out clause in it. Because normally, in peacetime, when you went through cadet training, if you flunked out, you went back to civilian life. But now here we are in wartime, and the thing is, they said, well, this is the agreement you signed, and now if we enforced our new law, which would be you're going to stay in the Navy as in some other capacity and not do any more flight training. And you know, being a young guy, and I thought, oh God, I don't want to do that. So I had an uncle in Florida who was an instructor at an Army Air Force base in middle part of Florida. And I called him up and I said, Uncle Walt, and he's the one that used to take me flying when I was 10 years old. And I said, could I get a job as a flight instructor? Oh, so he talked to one of the people he knew. And this is Emory Riddle. You know, Emory Riddle is still around today.
Oh, yeah.
And this was Riddle McKay, but it was still in the same company. And so he sent me down to Clewiston, Florida, where...
But you were mustered out of the Navy then?
Yeah. And when I got to Clewiston, after I'd been there, went through the training of how to be a flight instructor, I had a total of, it got to be less than 100 hours. I wouldn't think, you know, I don't remember what kind of time I had. And there was a guy, his name was McDonald, another Irishman, and he was one of those old-timer guys who, if you know anything about a layered super solution back in the early days, a kind of a biplane with low wing to the ground, and he was a good guy, but he'd do the maneuver, and he'd say, okay, you do it. This is in steerments. And anyway, if he didn't like it, okay, I got it. He'd do it again, then you do it. And when it was right, okay, we went on to the next thing. So anyway, I got through all the maneuvers fine, and they made me a flight instructor, and I didn't know anything. Today, they make a big deal about being a flight instructor, and you have to have the laws of learning and all those things, but I never had any of that. And I got my commercial license in 1943, and I went to see American Airlines at that time, and I came up from Florida, and they said, well, you know, if you have to get some kind of a release so you could come with us. And I later learned from the guy who was head of the draft board in Darien, Connecticut. He was a World War I Congressional Medal of Honor guy, and machine gunner, and that kind of an Englishman name was. Anyway, he says, well, I would have given it to you if you come to see me. And I could have gone to work then, and then they would have sent me over to India to be flying the hump and DC-3s and B-24s. But you know, I didn't do it. So I did about 9 months in Florida, Clewiston, and teaching British cadets how to fly. And I go through the whole program. They had soloing. They even had, which I thought was their program, the British program was better than the American program in some ways. They skipped basic training. They went from the Stearman to the AT-6. They didn't have any basic training. Same amount of time, but more time in each airplane.
They didn't do the marching, the book stuff.
Yeah.
They flew.
Right.
They did.
So, but anyway, that's the way that went as far as their training program. There was 10% of the cadets there were American. The rest of them were British.
It's interesting. Just to back up a little bit. Now, you mentioned that your sister and your brothers all went in the service at one time. You were all in the service at the same time.
All four of us were in the service.
So, has your sister gotten into service by now?
My sister was a spar, a Navy woman in the Navy. She was a teletype, code, and she went to Madison, Wisconsin for her training, or that's where she got her training. And she was there for most of the war. She was out in the Midwest in various places.
Had she met someone by now?
And the funny part about that all is she came home on a leave one time, and my mother said to her, "Come on, Ollie, I'm going to take you down to the local bar." And I knew all we grew up in that time.
Yeah.
So they're sitting there having a beer, and that's where she met her husband, who was in radio. He was a Marine. He was in radio school right there, which at one time, and prior to the war, was an old soldiers' home. When the war came along, they turned it into a Navy training communication, and Jerry Alexander was taking his training there.
I'll be darned.
And then he went out in the Pacific, and he was in a couple of the Big Island attacks that they had, and he came home and so forth. But that's where she met you, and you know,
Now
my mother was always a promoter.
well, I guess.
And that's where she met Jerry, and a year or so later they got married.
Now, the two younger brothers, they were in the service?
My brother, Pete, Walter Peter, we call him Pete, he was in B-25s, or B-24s. He did 25 missions out of England in the B-24, and came home, and he says a lot of crazy things happened. We shouldn't be dead, but we're alive, which happens in wartime. And then he got restless at home, and he went back, and they sent him out in the Pacific in A-26s. My brother Billy got out of high school early. They could do some way in war, and he went to work for Piper in Pennsylvania and helped them build airplanes and then ferry some of them to various parts of the United States. And Billy was in a training program, and then the war ended and he got out. But 2 years later or a year later, he went back in the cadet program and became a pilot also.
Which service?
Oh, he was in the Air Force.
Okay.
Army Air Corps, whatever I call it. About 1948, he went through flight training.
Did he stay in the service then, make a career, or did he get out?
Well, he stayed in it long enough. He finished flight training. They put him in DC-4s, and I forget how much longer he spent with them, but he got out in the early 50s somewhere.
Okay. Well, let's go back. I wanted to catch up on that because I knew every one of the kids had been in the service. And so now you've been training British pilots and a few
Yeah.
Americans, and something comes along after that.
Well, I taught the British pilots, and then one of the ways they kept it proper was the fact that when I was teaching the British cadets, I had to go to Camp Blanding, which is in Florida, if I remember right, and I took a bus early in the morning. I took a bus, and I was assigned into the Army, and that's how they made us a part of the military. But when I went through cadet training, they called us former flight instructors, and we went together as a group of guys who were teachers and then went through the formal training.
And this is where? Where did you do that?
Oh, I was in San Antonio for pre-flight. I went to north of LA for primary flight training.
Which was in what airplane?
Stearman still. And then I went up to, for basic training up into, I remember that's a hot part of middle southern California for basic training. And they came and said, we need some volunteers to go to West Point because in the war, the cadets 3 months out of the year were in school in the wintertime, and they did all their training in just north of West Point, and there was an airfield there which was a military airfield, and so they needed volunteers to come to keep the program running until the cadets came back in the spring. So we were the fill-in type of people. So I finished my flight training there and went from there to Luke Field in Phoenix and did my aerial gunnery, ground and air, and then I was all through.
And what airplane were you flying at Luke?
Just the AT-6 with a little
30 caliber?
30 caliber.
Charge it in the cockpit?
That's it.
Yeah.
I used to do, I always remember this, the sleeve guy goes by and you're in the turn and all that. And so when you break off, you come down and you have all that speed, you're going up. And I used to do a slow roll to get back up into the, in the line. I hear this voice coming, O'Neill, cut that out. Yes, sir. But I loved it. It was a great thing.
Can you remember Luke in those days is out in the middle of nowhere?
Yes, it was.
I mean,
Yeah, it was.
there wasn't much to either Phoenix then either.
No.
So
All I had to do was pay a few bucks and bought a little property. I'd probably be a lot wealthier today.
either that or you've
Yeah.
been broke from the tax.
Yeah. So anyway, my wife was pregnant.
Now wait a minute.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, you didn't have a wife in my story. So where did you meet your wife?
Oh, she's a hometown.
No, I mean the first wife. Where did just the one you have at Luke? That's your
Yeah.
first wife?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
how did you two meet?
Well, she was still in high school. I was out of high school.
So she's a high school friend.
High school girlfriend.
Okay,
Yeah, that's how I met her.
okay.
She was Catholic, same as me.
So when did you get married? At what?
Bakersfield is where I had went for basic training. It was Bakersfield, California, in the summertime. And I want to tell you, you stand in parades there, and you could almost sink into the asphalt. It was bad.
And
And that's where I heard about swamp coolers. You ever know what a swamp cooler is?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the first place I ever saw a swamp cooler was in Bakersfield, California. So
Yeah.
anyway, they sent me all back to Stewart Field in New York, just above West Point, and I finished my flight training there.
I still got to go back. You went home at where did you go back? At what point in this story did you get married? Where did that happen back?
Oh, then I finished up. I came up from Florida, and I said, well, I want to go do something better in flying than teaching. I wanted to fly the bigger, better airplanes. And my whole goal in life for flying was always fly the bigger, faster airplane, which as pilots we're all the same. That's what we want to do. And so being that I was still in the Army, and they sent me down to Texas to go through primary or basic training, and then from there they sent me down to San Antonio to do pre-flight, and then California, and then Stewart Field in New York to finish my flight training.
But is your wife with you on all these things?
No.
No.
She came out when I was in primary flight training in California, and that's where she got pregnant. Anyway, which means, you know,
No, that's not, is that Bakersfield by chance?
well, no, it was in the other place where, where's a big airport, military north side of LA? And then was a primary field where we did the primary flight training.
I don't know. The Dannenberg's up there.
No. But anyway, not far from LA.
Okay.
All I can remember is on weekends when I was there, we used to hitchhike down into LA to have a weekend.
So you're married, your wife's pregnant, and
Yeah, I got married when I was in basic training in Texas, and I asked for a leave to go home and get married, and they said, well, you know, I don't know if we can do that. But anyway, first thing I know, there was my pass, and I got on the train, went to Connecticut, was there a few days, got married, and spent one night in New York, and took her back home, and got back on the train, went back to Texas.
and you're progressing through all this training. I've never heard so many different places to get trained. At what point do you get to the bigger and better airplane, the faster ones?
Well, pretty much when I got out to Luke Field in Phoenix was the only time I got in a bigger airplane. That was a P-51.
Prior to that had been the SNJ,
Yeah.
and then you went from SNJs to P-51s,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a nice jump.
Oh, it was a beautiful airplane. I loved that P-51.
So,
And I was flying with Chinese students, and at the time, the whole thing was to keep them going into Mexico all the time, and the place called Ajo, which is south of Luke, and it's a mining town, and that gunnery school, even years later, was still there.
yeah, it's called the Barry Goldwater Training Area.
Well,
It's still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can drive down the road and hear the planes firing there.
Yeah.
You can watch them come in and,
So this is way after World War II, and I was then with the airlines, and I belonged to a group of doctors and airline pilots, and Barry Goldwater took us down to the Aho training area, and I heard this broom. I go, what is? I asked him, how fast are these guys going? Well, I forget, 350 knots or
at least.
Yeah,
These are in the
400 knots.
A-10s?
Huh?
Were these the A-10s out of Tucson?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they,
When they told us that. That's the first I knew about the Gatling gun,
yeah,
and that sound, you know, just broom.
yeah,
And I thought, wow.
yeah, that was probably 50 or 60 rounds.
But Barry Goldwater
Yeah,
had this group of people to his house,
okay,
and I don't remember the year now. It'd be in the 60s somewhere. And after JFK was assassinated, he came in, and once a year we had a meeting in Connecticut, and then once a year we would go somewhere else. And Barry Goldwater was one of the ones that gave the whole group of us took us. We went out there to Phoenix and had a big party. But he came in, and this is back in Connecticut, and here comes Senator Barry Goldwater. He's got a flight suit on, and he's got patches from every Air Force in the U.S., and he was a very colorful guy.
yeah, he was. His brother Bob was a hell of a golfer. He could almost been a professional.
Really?
Yeah. I used to pick up Bob Hope at Burbank and bring him over to the Phoenix Open, and he always stayed with Bob Goldwater. And it was,
Yeah, and you know, I used to a couple of times when Bob Hope would get on the airplane in the airlines, and I'd go back to say hello. But I used to talk to him about golf. I used to say, Mr. Hope, how's your golf? Oh, he says, pretty good. Not as well as I would do, but he was and then we'd see an airplane go by. He says, I think you better go back up in the cockpit. But yeah.
So you're Luke. You're flying P-51s,
Yeah.
and what happens after that?
Then I got out of service.
Has your wife had the baby?
No. A month after I got out of the service, in April, the baby was born.
Boy or girl?
Huh?
Boy or girl? Boy or girl?
Oh, girl.
Okay.
And 3 years later, I had a boy.
Now, flying's your love. You leave the Army Air Corps,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
what do you do?
I got out of service in March of 46, and I had a friend of mine that said to me, hey, listen, this guy's going to open up a flying service in seaplanes. And he said, I'd like you to come and start the business for him. So I was the only instructor he had, and I didn't know much about seaplanes. So a brand new Piper Cub on floats in May of 46, I got my instructor rating. And I had the same instructor that gave me my commercial license with wheels, Piper Cub. And he asked me the question, he says, now how do you sail this airplane, the seaplane? And you do it with the ailerons and the turning and so forth. And I'm thinking, oh, how do I answer that question? Nice guy, did the flight test, that came out well, and that's when I became a flight instructor. I went back, went to work, and stayed there a couple of years to 48.
Now, where was this?
In Stamford, Connecticut.
Okay.
And in 1949, I went with a what they call a non-sched airline called something Airways, Mercury Airways, and it was in DC-3s and C-46s, and we went 5 nights a week we went to Detroit and picked up parts for the factories back on the East Coast. And it was very crucial because if the weather was bad, they'd have to shut down part of our production line, but they didn't have the parts that they needed. That's all I remember about it, but we used to go to Philadelphia and or Newark.
Did you like
Huh?
the 46 or 47 the best? Can you remember?
Well, the C-46 was a big airplane to me.
Really big
Yeah.
compared to the
And
DC-3.
and I got along good with the chief pilot, who was a good pilot. And he wanted me to stay with the company, but I'd previously made an application to American Airlines, and this is I was 27 for 1950, and he wanted me to stay with his mostly cargo operation and all that, and the C-46 and so forth, and they paid us. Remember, I was $60 a week, and some weeks we didn't get paid, which was pretty normal in those days. And, but I loved it. You know, I got the training, and then one day I came home from a trip, and here's a telegram from American Airlines said, "You're still interested in a job flying for us? Come such and such." So I called up, went down to New York City, and got hired, and that's where I went.
So you're based where then?
Hmm?
You're based in New York?
Yes. For the next 14 years, I think, I stayed, and I went from the Convair 240, DC-6, DC-7. I went to the Lockheed Electra. I went to 707, Convair 990, and then the C-747.
When you were flying the Electras, they had lost a few of those.
The wing came off.
And
And the reason the wing came off, there was an imbalance between the wing, which goes this way in turbulence or rough air, and the engine is going this way, and that worked into the inboard section of the wing, and eventually they grounded them for a period of, I don't know, 2 weeks or whatever it was, and then they went through a strengthening. They cut the speeds back on the airplane, and kept on flying them, and then they all went to Tulsa and got a new beefing up in that area.
And was this all the whole time in New York? You never went to?
Yeah.
And can you remember what it was like to go from props to the 707 to a jet?
Well, that was, to me, we didn't know much about flying a jet, period. We're all pilots, and we all had our own way of doing things like pilots do. The pilots who were good instrument pilots didn't have any trouble making the transition from piston to jet. But the pilots who were not good instrument pilots couldn't hack it.
Well, why would that be?
Well, mostly their basic skills, and you had to be an instrument pilot, could interpret what you're looking at and what you're going to do. Dutch rolls were one of the things we had.
Explain that.
A Dutch roll starts from a yawing of the airplane, and where it like wallows, goes off to one side and then comes back to the other side, kind of like a cradle movement. But if you stay in it, it becomes more severe, and you can get way up, and that's how we lost one of the in training. But you had to learn the technique of how to deal with it. You stomped on the rudder, cross controls, and that's flattened it out, and that's how you lived with it.
Is that when they put the fin on the tail underneath it on the 707? Or did that?
Not so much that as what they did is the original 707 had only 16 degrees of travel on the rudder. And so what they did, they made a hydraulically boosted rudder on the airplane. I was in the second class of 707, so that's, you know.
The beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning of it. And they had a little tube on there called a beer can, we used to call it, that stuck out in front of the fin of the 707. And what that did is when it got below a certain speed, you allowed more pressure. So the idea was at high speed you couldn't exert a lot of rudder because you're going to roll it or
Tear the
whatever
tail
you're
off.
going to do.
Yeah.
Sure. But Dutch rolls was just something you lived with. And some of these old timers figured out a crosswind takeoff, instead of having the wing into the wind, the way without getting it, what would happen is you get into fooling with the rudders, and that started the Dutch roll. So they said, okay, let's leave the rudders alone, and we'll use the other. So they would put the wing the other way. So in a takeoff, instead of the left wing being down, it would be up, and that's the way we could keep it on the runway.
That's interesting. Just backwards.
Yeah, but it worked.
I was at Opelika in Miami when the 707 guys were checking out at Masters,
Yes.
and their problem seemed to be landing short, you know, figuring
Yeah.
out where the end of the runway was,
Yeah.
and the spool up time on the engines.
Yeah, because when you slow the airplane down, the engine bleeds down, and then here you are trying to get some power, and there was too much time from the time you decided you need power until you got it. So if you started too late with the recovery, you don't have any power. We had one on a training flight in the desert there north of where Lockheed was, up on the north side of LA. And same way, they landed short of the runway for the same reason. The guy is trying to show off and say, okay, I can make without touching the power. We used to play games, come in over Palm Springs, like here, close the power, all the way, 20,000 feet, all the way off, idle, and not touch it till we touch down. And you know, but these were the games we played. Traffic wasn't what it was later,
Yeah.
but we got pretty good at it.
Well, that 707 was certainly a breakthrough airplane,
Oh,
and
marvelous airplane. Once they put the bigger engines and the fan engines on it, terrific performer.
Now there was a big difference between the General Electric engines and the fans that they put on them, and then on the P&Ws.
Yeah.
Anyway, you want to go a little bit into that?
Well, the GE engine, which the only one we had, was the Convair 990, which had GE engines on it. Very smooth reversers on it, hydraulically actuated instead of air, which you had on the 707. But the engine, the GE engines, didn't put out the thrust like they were supposed to. So we were always burning more fuel than we were supposed to. And we used to say to the dispatcher, hey, listen, you know, we can't do this because we're not going to burn what you say we're going to burn.
Yeah.
And we all knew, but my impression that the engine worked good, but it wasn't a high altitude airplane. Didn't get the power out of it.
Well, when they went to the fans, that was a big step, wasn't it?
Oh,
to
biggest
get the
step.
bypass?
And when we went to the fan engine, all the difference in the world. We took the same basic engine and got 18,000 pounds of thrust on it versus 13 with water. I flew the early 707s, we call them water wagons, when you used water injection for takeoff. And you had a timer, you punched the clock once you started your takeoff run, because you only had like a minute and a half before you were going to run out of water. And they had two 25 horsepower engines, one on each side. And they always tell the story in LA of a TW airplane, and he lost water injection on one side. And they say he went across from one runway to the other runway and kept on going. Now, whether it's true or not, I don't know.
Did you continue married to the same woman and having children with her?
Yes.
And so what was the final result of that union in children?
I got divorced in 1969
And
from my first wife. I married my second wife.
2 children though from the first
Two
one?
children.
Okay.
And then I married my second wife in 1970 and had one more. And then I inherited 3 of her children, so I ended up with 6 children.
Okay. And did that union last then?
Yes, lasted 38 more years.
Good.
And my wife died 3 years ago.
I'm sorry.
And you're not supposed to, your wife is supposed to outlive you, not
Yeah.
supposed to die before you were still alive.
You know, and that's true. We've been married 53 years, and I'm convinced she's going to outlive me, even though we all have some form of health problems.
Right. I was married a total of 62 years.
Yeah.
24 for the first, 38 the second.
Now, did you start flying international?
Oh yes, I did.
And would you pick international over domestic flying for any reason?
Well, flying over the ocean is very boring
Yeah.
versus up and down domestically. I used to fly to Rio, out of Dallas, DC-10 international model.
Were you still flying when the DC-10
Yes, I was.
had the engine?
I was playing golf in a golf tournament in San Diego, and one of our agents who I knew in San Diego, he come out and he says, you know, we just lost a DC-10 in Chicago. I said, come on. And this guy always was telling a million jokes.
It's the engine that came off?
Yes. And you know, if the poor guy had not been a student of our training, which says when you lose an engine, you go to V2. And that's what he did. But he lost all the hydraulics on one side of the airplane because it all bled out, which the engineering said, oh, that can't happen now. Well, yes, it did. So one side had no leading edge flaps, and so and thus his stall speed became higher. When he went back to V2, well, he was where he didn't belong, and that's why it rolled over.
Now, as I remember that, they had damage with a forklift, lifting the engine up.
And the guy committed suicide. The foreman on the job committed suicide.
He was the one that they were using the forklift.
The forklift, in which the FAA did not like their procedure, but America says it saves us a lot of time. So they broke for lunch, left it up on the forklift in place. It was only 3 bolts, you know, but they were stressed enough at that point that they developed the cracks, which I don't know how long the time period evolved, that they broke, and that's how it fell off the airplane.
Sad.
Yeah, but it's a, the DC-10 was a very good airplane. Strong, well built, flew well.
Well, they changed the terminology when the planes got so big. They started calling them heavies.
Oh yeah, well that's over 300,000 pounds. Anything over 300,000 pounds was a heavy.
Now that 300,000 pounds, that's loaded.
Yes.
Loaded.
Yeah.
And of the planes you flew, which ones? You didn't mention the 747 really. That was your last airplane.
Yes.
And how many years were you in 47s?
5 years.
And did you fly different models of that, or they started stretching them?
No, American didn't have many. We had mostly 100s, and we had some 200s. So when Braniff went bankrupt, they came to American and said, okay, we'd like you to fly the route from Dallas to London because there's nobody on it. And they wanted to keep our amount of flights, that came to
Or to Heathrow?
well, the main airport in London,
Heathrow?
Heathrow. And the other place, when we first came to flying to London, we went into the other airport.
And that's
then,
on the west side. What's that?
But we bought the landing rights from TWA.
Yeah, you sure wouldn't want to give up landing spots.
Well, that
At
was
Heath-
it. So
Yeah.
they came. So they put together a group of guys, and we started flying the 100s into London.
Well, that airplane's still one of the.
Huh?
The 747 is still one of the workhorses of the world.
Well, I always felt it was one of the things I liked about it. It's the only airplane where would feel like you're really it's like a captain on a big vessel. By going up the stairs and into the cockpit, you're in your own whole different area than you used to be.
Yeah.
Because every airplane I ever flew, you got in the door and you went up to the cockpit, and that was it. Whether you got in the back or the front didn't make any difference. And the 747, you really felt, oh, hey, this is something.
Can you
Nice airplane, though.
Can you remember any major emergencies you had during that?
No, some engine outs and nothing. I go back to my early days as a captain, and the guys all grumbled about the engines, and I always babied my engines, and they took care of me, so that was the deal.
Were your engines such that as you went up to altitude, you had to keep watching them from over temping?
Yes.
You had to keep coming back a little to keep them under the red line?
Yeah. But the early engines, the early 707s, without the bigger engines, we used to fly 27,000, 28,000 westbound, 27,000 eastbound. Couldn't get any higher out because we were loaded up with passengers.
Yeah.
And that was, they just didn't have the power. They had water injection for takeoff. We had little things, but I always felt that the 707 was really a marvelous airplane. I flew it for 12 years.
Now, you mentioned that you retired after 5 years in the 747. How many years then did that give you as a airline pilot?
33 years.
33 years. And so in seniority, where would you have been on the captain's list?
I got down before I retired about number 10.
Number 10. That's amazing. So let's see, 33 years. How old would you have been when you
27 when I started.
when you started? And did you have to retire because of a certain age?
Well, age 60 was the thing, which was started in 1960, if I remember right, 60 or 61.